We've got 3 of the most off-road focused 4x4 utes on sale in Australia right here. We've got the Ford Ranger Raptor, the HSV Colorado SportsCat, and the newcomer, the Nissen Navara N-Trek Warrior. And we're here to find out which is the toughest off-road. When you look at list prices, this Ranger Raptor is by far the most expensive ute in the comparison, but it's also had the most work done to it as well. When you compare it to a normal Ranger, you'll see that this is much taller and significantly wider. There's more suspension under there and there's bigger wheels and tyres as well. Have a look at these wheel arches here. They're flared out massively to accommodate these wheels and tyres and the much larger wheel track that this Ranger Raptor has over a normal Ranger. Those tyres are pretty big too. They're the biggest on this comparison, BF Goodrich KO2 all-terrains, and they're probably the most aggressive as well. Behind those are Fox shocks. They're race bred and the most impressive shocks out of all these 3 utes. And Ford has even gone to the lengths of removing those leaf springs from the back and the drum brakes. It's coils with those fancy shocks and discs now. Ford's Ranger Raptor is the biggest of these 3, both in terms of wheelbase and wheel track. That means it does have a lower ramp over angle. Because it does have the biggest tyres, however, that translates into the best in terms of overall ground clearance on paper. Low range gearing for the Raptor is number 1 in this company. When HSV ran out of Commodores to play with, they turned their attention to the Holden Colorado ute, and this is what they came up with, the SportsCat. It's got a different look to your normal Colorado. It's been lifted up with different suspension and there's also different wheels and tyres there. You notice this grille is different. There's a stick-on bonnet bulge there too to set it apart. But probably the most important thing is that HSV has spent their time tuning the suspension and the wheels and tyres to make this thing different from the Colorado. Another unique point is the options that you can run with this SportsCat. There's AP racing brakes, which we have fitted here, but you can also go for Super Shock dampers. There's new seats and steering wheel on the inside for 2020, along with a bit of suede and leather splashed around the place. There's a sailplane and hard tonneau cover on the back there, and a couple of red recovery points on the front, but nothing on the back. On-paper specs can be a bit misleading for four-wheel drives, but they don't paint the best picture for the SportsCat. It's got the smallest diameter tyres of all 3 here and the lowest listed ground clearance. A shorter wheelbase does yield a good ramp over angle, but low range gearing is on the shallow side. This is the Nissen Navara N-Trek Warrior. Take one normal STX and give it to the engineering firm Premcar to have a fiddle with. And what they're doing is looking for more off-road performance. So what they've done is wheels, tyres, suspension and steering. These Cooper Discoverer AT3s are taller and wider than the normal offering, and they're sitting on a different 17-inch alloy wheel. Springs and shocks have changed all around, although the Nissan already had coils at the back there. That's a 5-link panhard rod setup. They've also changed out the front bump stops. They're bigger and more progressive for those big hits you have off-road sometimes. And you might notice that bumper on the front. That's actually a genuine Nissan steel bull bar with those hoops deleted. And a little Hella light bar as well. The tow bar has been redesigned as well to suit the suspension lift of the Navara and also add more clearance off-road. Thanks to the steel bull bar, the N-Trek Warrior has the best approach angle out of all 3, although the departure angle isn't as good as the competition. We'd put that down to the factory fitted tow bar. Low range gearing is good and ground clearance is much improved. This HSV Colorado does have some good off-road credentials of its own. It's had a suspension lift, it's got bigger tyres and they're more aggressive, a bit better for off-road. However, the suspension isn't tuned specifically for off-road performance and it is a little bit firmer. You hear my keys jangling around there in the barrel. As I'm driving along, it just bounces along. It's got a firmer spring, it's got a firmer shock as well than the other utes on test here. And it means you can't just travel at the same pace off-road and do it comfortably. These Cooper Xeon tyres do make a positive impact on the Colorado overall. There's more grip there, a bigger footprint once again, which is exactly what you want when you're driving on off-road stuff, dirt, fast dirt, slow dirt, whatever it might be. Along with working on the suspension, wheels and tyres, HSV has done a bit of work to the steering of this Colorado as well. And it's of benefit. The Colorado is tidy in that regard. However, this one just feels a bit more responsive, a bit sportier, and a bit sharper as well. The HSV SportsCat doesn't have a locking rear diff. It's the only ute out of these three not to. But it does have a limited slip rear diff, and that is beneficial on the high-speed dirt stuff, as well as on road. It means when you're trying to use all that 500 Newton meters under the bonnet from the 2.8 litre turbo diesel that this car has, you're not spinning wheels as quickly. The rear end stays more composed and it's more willing to put the power down to the ground. So while that ride is certainly firm and bumpy over rough surfaces, there's no issues with traction and acceleration. This engine is actually one of the perkiest here on test. This is the Nissen Navara Warrior, a Nissan Navara STX, but reimagined by the engineering team at Premcar. They were commissioned by Nissan to build a Navara that took everything to the next level, and I think it's what they've done. This has new specification springs and shocks front and rear, a new wheel and tyre package, and there's a steel bull bar on the front there as well with a small light bar on it. But the most important thing about all that work they've done is the tuning. So they went to work out in South Australia. I got to drive a suspension prototype a little while ago, and they got to work using different springs and different shocks and trying to find a tune of both of those things that works for the Navara. And this is the end product, and it's a vast improvement in my book. The Navara is quite good in its fourth iteration. They've fixed up that rear end, they've got the damping where it should be. But this is just taken to the next level. You've got more clearance there, you've got more traction from the tyres and that sort of thing. And from the driver's seat over rough terrain, it just soaks everything up a bit more. And while it's not the trick suspension that the Ranger Raptor has with bypassing and internal pistons and all that sort of thing, it's still very good. It gives you great control from the driver's seat, handles things nicely. What hasn't changed is the driveline, and that's a 2.3 litre twin turbo diesel, 140 kilowatts and 450 Newton meters. So it is outgunned by the others on this comparison. Still not a bad driveline, however, running through a 7-speed automatic gearbox, part-time four-wheel drive like the rest, shift on the fly and low range. It's pretty perky and responsive, although not as outright fast as the others on test. But for off-roading, general driving around the place, I think it's got enough power to get the job done. All that engineering work that Ford has done to this Raptor makes a car that drives significantly different to a normal Ranger. The Raptor does get criticised for its on-road driving a little bit because there is a bit of a lack of grip there, especially on wet bitumen. The tail does get a little bit swing happy around corners. But when you're off-road, it's a completely different story. I'm in four-wheel drive high range at the moment, and these BF Goodrich tyres offer stacks and stacks of grip. It feels really sure-footed. The tyres are taller and they're wider as well, so there's a bigger footprint there. But of course, the other piece of that puzzle is suspension. And the suspension in this Raptor is frankly exquisite. Fox shocks, all they do is develop off-road racing suspension, high-end suspension for the aftermarket. And the stuff that they've fitted to this car makes an incredible difference. There's a lot of technology in those shock absorbers. They've got an internal floating piston that keeps oil and gas separate. It's got bypass technology as well, which means the shock absorber is initially really soft for those movements. So this thing soaks up bumps beautifully. But when you hit a really big bump, the shocks firm up very quickly, which means you don't bottom out, and you've got significantly more control over this car when you're driving high speed stuff, as well as low speed as well. Enough off-road dirt driving now. I've got a track in mind up here that's more low speed, it's more technical, it's going to test articulation, it's going to test ground clearance, it's going to test stability and traction as well. It's It's going to be a really good track to find out what the differences are between these three utes and where their strengths and weaknesses are. Let's go have a look. This Ranger Raptor does have the highest listed ground clearance on paper, and it's also got the tallest tyres in terms of diameter, so there is a bit of a natural advantage there compared to the two other utes. But it doesn't matter what happens on paper, we're going to see how it goes in real life. This track here is really washed away with water. There's a big gully running through the middle of it, and there's only really one line I can take it on, so I'm going to have to try and go through, straddle it, see how this car feels. Neutral, low range, let that go in. And I'll stick it in manual mode 2 and just keep it in first gear, and let's just see how this thing goes. And because it's so wide too, that wider wheel track makes this car feel really stable. Grippy tyres as well, it's pretty good, I have to say. Naturally, that front end doesn't have the same sort of articulation as the rear, so it still does flop around a little bit, like most dual cab utes, but that wider wheel track, like I said before, there's actually different components in there to help give it that wider wheel track. It's not just wheel offset. Makes a big difference, and this has more stability, more flex in the front end than pretty much any other independent front suspension ute. 10-speed gearbox with low range gives you nice reduction as well in that first gear. You can lock it into first and it's not going to come out. Use these paddles, it's nice and easy. See there, I'm doing 10 k's an hour with 2,500 RPM, which is kind of quick I suppose, but you can drop it right down too to a really slow crawl for that technical driving. It's exactly what you want. That section we just went down, going to go back up again. That's going to be a bit of a challenge. All right, that's already starting to slip around there. Let's put on locking rear differential. There we go. Now, there we go, look at that. Makes life a lot easier. One thing to note about this Ranger Raptor as well is that Ford has engineered it to use the locking rear differential and the traction control system at the same time. So that rear end's completely locked, but the computers in the car will also control traction on the front end at the same time, which does make a big difference. That feels really nice and stable through there, no worries in the world. Bit of a side angle, that's all good. It's good lateral grip in these tyres, which is surprising because there's not much of it on road at all. That is doing a very impressive job of climbing up. Easy, very easy. The fact that this SportsCat has more tyres, more suspension than a normal Colorado means there's more ground clearance there, so there should be more traction from those tyres as well. So it should be a better bet off-road. And the Colorado is quite good in its normal form as well. However, the proof is in the pudding. Here we are. I'll stop, stick it in low range. Stability control is off now. First gear. Let's see how we go. Decent engine braking, I've noticed, first thing there. We'll drop into this little ravine here. Straight on. There we go. Oh, it's flopped over. I think we're on two wheels there almost. It's worth noting that this is the only four-wheel drive in the comparison with leaf springs as well. Navara has coils, and Ford did swap out the Ranger's leaf springs for coils in the Raptor. One thing I really like about this Colorado is the engine and the driveline. It's a fairly traditional setup. Single turbo, 2.8 litre turbo diesel, but there's 500 Newton meters of torque there. There's 147 kilowatts through a 6-speed torque converter gearbox and low range. And it gives you nice control over the car. You're not necessarily waiting for turbos to kick in to get a little bit of torque happening. It just comes through when you need it. But it would feel much more at home off-road if that suspension was a bit more on the soft side. Especially when you're doing what we're doing here and what a lot of people do, I think, which is drive around fairly unladen. Going to head back up this climb now through those articulation spots, and I'm going to be really interested to see how this SportsCat goes. Pick the same lines and turn that parking sensor off. All right, no locking rear diff there. That's struggling to do it. It's done it though. There we go. You can see the difference straight away. What a locking diff makes. It's like a magic button for a four-wheel drive. Oh, it's ticked off again there. Come on. There we go. Just a bit of clearance there too, and you can hear that ABS system just working overtime, trying to control. Then it was front left, back right wheel, spinning like crazy. Now turn into this next bank here, same thing will happen. And up we go. Still does it, but just doesn't do it as easy as it possibly could. When I drove the Warrior suspension development mule, it was in sandy conditions and it performed well there, but sand is a bit different to mud and rock and wet stuff like what we've got here. So this will be a really interesting challenge for this new car. Heading down hill to this first challenge here, into this deep rut. I'm going to stick it in low range, I better do that. Give this thing the best chance it's got. Manual first gear. And let's see how this suspension and the tyres handle it. Navara's got great visibility over the front end here. You can really see what's going on. It feels a bit smaller, easier to handle than the other utes. And that is a bit of a wheel lift there in the back, but it's smooth. The coil springs aren't overly stiff, so you can feel the car soaking up a bit of that stuff. It's pretty good. The important thing to note with this Navara is, even though the suspension's been lifted, the front springs are actually softer, which is interesting. So they're just a longer spring overall, but softer, even though there is a bit of steel hanging off the front there. So that means it's more supple. It's playing from the Raptor's handbook in a way, I suppose. This is suspension that's tuned for off-road performance more than on-road, and you can feel the benefit here. It does feel great. The SportsCat has Cooper tyres as well, but these are a different one on the Navara Warrior. These are an AT3 with LT light truck construction, which is great for a four-wheel drive. It's going to be doing a lot of touring off-road. LT just means it's a stronger tyre through the carcass and that sort of thing. Probably doesn't ride as nicely on-road, but you get big benefits off-road. They're a nicely balanced tyre as well. They seem to be nice on-road, but with good increase in performance off-road at the same time. The guys at Premcar told me that they actually benchmarked a lot of off-road tyres and came up with these being the best in terms of a balance between good off-road and on-road performance. All right, now the Navara Warrior's chance to go back up this hill. Good test of articulation and traction. First bit here. Raptor needed that diff lock on. And, well, this is doing it without it, but I think I'll turn it on too. Makes a hell of a noise. Let's see if that makes life a bit easier. Look at that, all those traction issues are gone. These tyres feel quite grippy actually. I'll turn up here. Bit of lateral grip loss there actually. Maybe not as grippy as the Raptor's tyres, but still quite good. There we go, it's done it pretty well. Looking to push these 4x4 utes a little harder, I went looking for some tougher challenges. And as the rain kept falling from the sky, I found something. While it wasn't hugely steep, this track was badly rutted from running water, exposing a slippery clay surface below the rocks and dirt. It looked to be the perfect challenge, testing out traction, articulation, stability and clearance in one fell swoop. But will these cars be able to do it? First up, I took the Ranger Raptor through, and it did it surprisingly easily. Now it was time for the HSV SportsCat, but things didn't go so smoothly. Put simply, the SportsCat wasn't able to straddle and climb through that slippery pinch. Both passenger side wheels went into the rut and wouldn't come back out. After trying my luck backwards and forwards a couple of times, I was bottomed out and I wasn't going anywhere. No problem though, bring down the Ranger Raptor for a quick snatch recovery. The HSV Colorado does have some nice shiny red recovery points on the front, but it is worth noting that a 4.7 ton shackle, which you normally use for this sort of thing, only just fits past the bodywork. Repeated use might end up with some cosmetic damage. Next up was the Nissen Navara. The track was looking a little bit worse for wear after the HSV went through, but I drove the same line at around the same pace to keep things as fair as possible. Unfortunately, the Nissen met the same fate. It went into the rut, but it couldn't climb out. Time for another snatch recovery. So far, the Ranger Raptor was the only ute to make it through this bit, but conditions were changing throughout the day and the track was a little bit more chopped up after all the action. So we thought it was only fair to try it again in the Ford. And it did it, easily. So we tried again. And it did it again. I'd call that pretty conclusive. Well, I think there's a couple of things that are pretty obvious to you guys who are watching this video. It's raining right now, it's been pissing down all day actually. We're all a bit soaked. It's been a pretty hard day in terms of production, but we've soldiered on and we've reached a conclusion. And I think that conclusion is pretty obvious as well. This Ford Ranger Raptor is #1. Now you've got to take into account that it's the most expensive on test by a fair margin, and it does come with deficits in terms of payload and towing capacity. Other utes don't have that. However, looking at four-wheel drive only, this is the winner. And #2, in my opinion, is the Nissen Navara N-Trek Warrior. Nissan and Premcar have done a great job of taking the Navara, which is a good ute in its own right, but just lifting the whole package up pretty conclusively. The suspension is tuned really nicely, the wheels and tyres work well off-road, and it's just all round an improvement. #3 is the HSV SportsCat. It does feel a little bit like a fish out of water in this company. It's a good ute and a very nice one on road, but off-road it just doesn't feel as home as these other utes. Tell us what you think in the comments below. Which is your favourite ute out of these three? And if you want to see more ute content, go check out our 11 ute mega test. It's huge, practically every ute on the market. And of course, don't forget to like and subscribe to Car Advice for more four-wheel drive and car content.